California, the reading capital of the world. Today, we're making time to speak with Kevin Ring, the president of Families Against Mandatory Minimums, or FAMM. Already this year, we've read Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. We've read 5 Days by Wes Moore. And on Wednesday night, 8:30 Eastern, 5:30 Pacific, Jackie Newman is kicking us off with our holiday book, Tattoos on the Heart, about gang violence in Los Angeles. In each of these books, the topic of mass incarceration plays an important role. And it's an issue that has started to really grab at my heartstrings. So I asked Kevin to come on so that he could tell us a little bit about these issues and we can have a roundtable discussion. So if you're interested in asking Kevin a question, please go ahead and open up your chat. You can ask a question right there. We're watching them all. You can make a comment if you're watching on LinkedIn Live or on Facebook. We want to make this as much of a interactive experience as possible. So thank you again for tuning in. Obviously, a very important discussion. Now, I also want to say that because this is so important to us at 99 Pages, we're running a little bit of a fundraiser for our subscribers. We're matching $2 for every $1 donated for the rest of the year. All you got to do is subscribe to 99 Pages on YouTube. Just make a comment, let us know how much you gave, and we'll be sure to match that right back to FAMM. We're going to do that up to $5,000. That means this is a $15,000 opportunity to solve one of the biggest social justice issues facing our nation. I cannot emphasize how important this is. Please share this video, get involved, and let's take a minute and talk to Kevin. Thanks again for joining us, sir. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me. Thanks for what you're doing.
Absolutely. And you know, we're all fired up to hear about your story, about the work that FAMM does. But I would really like to start with your narrative. You used to be a lobbyist for Jack Abramoff. You even worked and built policy for Senator John Ashcroft. I mean, you were a political powerhouse in DC, right? So how on earth did you start, on earth did you find yourself in charge of this of FAMM?
Well, it's funny. First of all, I worked for a member of Congress, so I've been to South Lake Tahoe a number of times because he represented that district. So we have that connection. You know, when I was sitting in a holding cell waiting to get arraigned on my charges the day they came and arrested me, I was with all these guys, and they said, "Sure is easy to get in trouble, and it's hard to get out of it." And I do feel like my life was that story. I was like the Alex P. Keaton from Family Ties. You know, that's how I was when I went to. I wasn't political growing up, but when I got to college, I got bit by the political bug, and I used to come down to Washington D.C. during the summer and intern, and you know, I just loved it. I loved politics. I loved being involved in policy, and so I worked in Capitol Hill. Went to law school at night. I graduated. And I was just a policy guy. And after a number of years, I met the woman I was going to marry. And there wasn't that much to do in Washington after you finish working on Capitol Hill. I hate to say that there's no marketable skills there, but a lot of the lobbying firms and law firms in town want you to come work for them. And so I had a lot of connections. I had a good amount of substantive knowledge from my work on the Hill. And so I got recruited to go to work at a law firm. And my main partner was Jack Abramoff, as you said, which turned out to be pretty fatal for me. So we worked as a lobbyist. You know, the firm ended up coming under investigation because he was defrauding these large clients of ours on the outside. But as part of the investigation, then the FBI looked at, well, how are you guys lobbying? Because once they got their nose under the tent through the outside fraud investigation, Abramoff's defense was, I'm not stealing from these people. I'm doing a lot for them. Look at all the things I'm getting from them from Congress. I'm stopping bills, or I'm getting them appropriations. So they said, well, what are you guys doing? So they started investigating us. And then that's when the focus came to us. And then it was, you know, hell on earth for me for about eight years as they'd started internal investigations in the FBI. I cooperated with the FBI for a couple of years. But as soon as I saw that I was about to be indicted, and I realized that these prosecutors thought I was a bad guy, and so, you know, they were going to come for me hard, and I thought my only choice now is a judge. I had to leave my last law firm. I heard about this group FAMM that was looking for help, and I thought, man, my only hope here is that a judge is going to see things differently than these prosecutors do. What if these prosecutors not only decided they could charge me and however many counts they want to bring, but they could pick my sentence, which is what mandatory minimums basically allow them to do. I know we'll talk more about that. And I thought, that's too much power. And so I learned the hard way how much power prosecutors have in our system, and I started working for FAMM. And then, I stayed working with them, and then everything happened. Then the government raided my house. I ended up being indicted because we couldn't reach a plea agreement. I went through 2 trials. The jury hung on my first one. A year later, they tried me again. I lost half the counts. I ended up going to prison. Well, I got sentenced to 20 months. The government had asked for 20 years for me. I got 20 months, thankfully. I served 15 and a half in prison. I came home and went right back to working for FAMM, where I've been for the last 5.5 years. We'll talk more about FAMM. I'll just say this, going through this process, I was grounded by the fact that I had my 2 daughters who were young and living with me. So that keeps you very focused, not on yourself. And working at FAMM, where I was hearing and learning about people who had it much worse than I did. It was easy to feel sorry for myself, but there are people, especially people of color, who were getting hit with long drug sentences and serving decades in prison that were not deserved. And so writing about their stories and trying to help them was also helpful to me to not get, want to be in a fetal position and just so, focused on myself. But I came to FAMM just because I was chased out of my law firms because of the government's investigation.
I mean, what is incredible about this, Kevin? You are I'm sorry?
Oh, you seemed like you were muted, but now I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I mean, you are a white collar professional. You were a lawyer, right? Yeah. Like, if anyone could have fought off the government off of a conviction charge like this, like, it would have been you. You end up going to prison as a knowledge worker. You're obviously not a threat, right? You are absolutely you committed maybe a non-violent crime, but yet they decided prison was the appropriate punishment for you. When you think about, I mean, this is a question that if you don't mind, I'm going to pop up a little earlier. I know we talked about it, but what is, did you think about this in when you were sitting in prison? Like, what is the utility of a prison? What role does prison actually serve in our society?
Yeah, of course, I had a lot of time to think about it because like I said, I cooperated for 2 years, and then we ended up going to a trial a year later, and then, I had 2 trials, and then I appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. So my fight went on for years. So I had a lot of time to think and worry about prison, and then show up there. And, the day my brother came to bring me, I just remember thinking, my daughters went to school because they didn't want to be home to see me leave. And, it had just been horrible the weeks leading up to that after I had to tell them I was going. And I remember when we were driving up there, and I just remember thinking, is this necessary, right? Like, are we using the least restrictive means we can to punish people? Like, prison should be the last resort. It should be, we can't keep this person in civil society because they're so offensive to our norms and the rest. And in our country, we use it, so frequently. So I thought about it a lot, and then I got there and I saw the people who were there, and it was different than I thought. So I was in a camp. People think of it as white collar or club fed. Those prisons don't exist anymore because of the drug war. Most of the people I served with were brown and black. They were there for drug crimes or gun crimes. And then there were white collar offenders like myself, but we were the minority. And I saw people, who just made mistakes in their life, and they weren't like master criminals. And they just didn't know what they were just making dumb decisions, right? They just weren't thinking about what they were doing. They weren't trying to game the system. But there was no real programming. There was nothing there. You were really just being warehoused. It was almost like a adult timeout where, I didn't have to worry about violence as much as people do in other facilities. You hear about Rikers Island and things like that. So I was lucky for that. But it just felt like a complete waste of time. And I felt like even for taxpayers, there was no return on that investment for them. You punish me, that's fine. But, and I was law school educated and the rest. But for the other people, you didn't use that time productively. People weren't encouraged to take classes, to improve themselves, to get anger management, cognitive behavioral therapy, other programs of treatment that might have made them more likely to succeed when they came out. And so it just felt like a big waste to me.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. I mean, when I heard your story and I watched a documentary called The Vanishing Trial, it's one of the documentaries that FAMM has put out, and I heard your story in that documentary. When I looked at you, I didn't see someone in a gang. I didn't see someone who was actively trying to commit crimes. I saw someone a lot like myself.
Yeah.
And I, working professional. And I thought to myself, man, if I had to go to jail and be away from my wife and my family and my friends for, up to a year or more, I mean, not only would that just be devastating to me, but I know that it would make me a worse person. Like whatever ill that the government was trying to cure in me, it would have made worse. And so it just blew me away to hear that story. So just for our viewers, and I see a lot of people, we've had a lot of people log in here in just the past few seconds while you were talking. Let's just get this simple question out there. What is a mandatory minimum, and why are they problematic? Let's just start with the simple.
The basics. Founded to address mandatory minimums. So normally what happens is a legislature, either Congress or state, will set a punishment for a crime. Let's say, burglary, and they'll give a range of punishments. They'll say anybody convicted of this crime, gets somewhere between 0 and 10 years. And then a judge will decide the punishment. A mandatory minimum says anybody who commits crime A will get this range of punishment, but no less than 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is. So they set a floor. That's the minimum. And it's mandatory because since it's in law, no matter what happens in plea negotiations or in the trial, the judge has to give that punishment. So it takes the discretion away from the judge. So it doesn't matter if you're Jean Valjean stealing a loaf of bread to feed your family, or you've got a, big, huge bread stealing operation that you're, selling for profit. Your motive doesn't matter. Whether it's your first offense doesn't matter. At that point, the judge has to give you that punishment. And so what should be clear to people, even intuitively, is that we want punishments to fit the crime. That's what you always hear. People say, oh, let the punishment fit the crime. That's the old adage. But how can a punishment fit the crime if there's no consideration of the circumstances of the crime? You take away all context. Context matters in everything we do. And so if you don't allow somebody to understand what the person was doing, what they were going through, what was their mental capacity, what was their motive, there's things that shouldn't count, right? Like race, religion, immutable characteristics. But there's a lot of other factors you'd want to know about somebody. I mean, if your children lie to you about stealing a cookie from the cookie jar, that's different than if they steal, they take the car and lie about why they did that. You want to know all the facts and circumstances of a crime, and you want to know and understand the defendant. So we have a system of separation of powers that usually allows the prosecution to bring the charges and a judge to make that determination. And mandatory is totally upset that by creating one-size-fits-all punishment.
I'm sorry, I did not mean to interrupt you there, Kevin. No. I apologize. I didn't mean to be rude. I wanted to, though, address, let's say, a counter-argument. Let's say, look, aren't mandatories going to be a deterrent for bad behavior? It's public knowledge, 5 years for this, 10 years for that. If we say this, there's a mandatory minimum, the expectation is that you as a citizen take it seriously. We mean business. So if they're all public knowledge and you still commit the crime, why shouldn't you do the time?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things about that. And that's a good question. You hear that a lot. You can't be deterred by something you don't know about. So if I were to ask you, living in California, which crimes in California actually carry mandatory penalties, I doubt you would know them. I doubt you would know what the penalties were even if you knew which crimes carried them. Right?
I have no idea. I'll tell you that, right?
Right. So if I said to somebody, 7 grams of powder cocaine, what's the penalty for that? I mean, a deterrent only works when you know that the thing exists. And so, one, people don't know. There have been studies about this. People don't know what the punishments are. Criminals do not sit there and read through the U.S. code and through their federal law and the state law books to figure out what the punishments are and then make these rational choices about committing crimes. So one, those penalties don't deter. And then two, you have to understand that crime is mostly a young person's game. And, the idea that people are deterred, young brains we know are not as developed. The brain science is clear about that. The prefrontal lobes are not as developed, especially men. We're impulsive. We make rash decisions. We're not thinking about the severity of the punishment. What we're thinking is we're not going to get caught. That's why people take chances and risks. That's why they commit crimes. And forever we've known, criminologists on the right and the left have agreed, that it's the swiftness and certainty of apprehension that matters. That's what deters people. That's why the extra cop on the street may be a deterrent, because you think you're going to get caught, and so you're not going to do something. But the idea that whether your punishment is 5 years, 7, or 10, that's going to change your behavior just isn't borne out by any data that we have.
I have a question then. Can we talk about, actually, excuse me, I have a question from a viewer.
Yeah.
Who is incentivized then to want a mandatory minimum? Like, is it politicians? Is it like, who actually says, yeah, this is an awesome idea?
Two groups. Lawmakers, it has become a proxy for showing that you care about something, right? So you could say, I really am concerned about gun crimes, and so I want to, increase the range of penalties that people could get, and I want judges to look at these, more seriously. Well, that's a lot of words. If you could say, I've got a new bill that says anybody caught with an illegal gun is going to get a minimum 10 years in jail. That looks good on a poster. That's what you want on your flyers and your mailers. Nothing says that you care more about attacking a crime than attaching a mandatory minimum to it. The other group that loves it, and these are connected because these people lobby the legislature for that, are prosecutors. Now, I don't think, I think prosecutors, I don't, no matter what I say, I think prosecutors, there's good ones, there's bad ones, just like there's good bakers and bad bakers. I don't think there's anything wrong with prosecutors per se, but I think our system needs oversight and accountability. And I think prosecutors in the system today have too much power. And mandatory minimums make their job easier because they can go to a defendant and say, either plead guilty and cooperate, or you're going to get this 10-year penalty because you're going to be found guilty at trial. And this is somebody who maybe doesn't know a lot. Look, I was a lawyer. I had all these benefits and advantages. But if you went to somebody and said 10 or 20 years in prison, unless you plead guilty, they're going to take that. That's why we had this movie, Vanishing Trial. Only 3% of cases today go to trial because people are bludgeoned with the threat of these long sentences. And as the defendant, that the judge isn't going to have any say. So if they had come to me and said, look, we're threatening you with 20 years and it's a mandatory minimum, I would have been in a world of hurt. That would have been a tougher decision to go to trial because I knew my judge was going to have some discretion because it wasn't a mandatory minimum. I made the choice to go to trial. It was still difficult. But so prosecutors like it because they don't have to go to trial. They don't have to put people to their proof. It makes their job easier. It totally makes sense why they like it, but it doesn't mean that it's right.
Wow. I mean, absolutely incredible. Folks, again, I know we have some activity coming in the chat. Keep them coming. If you have questions for Kevin about mandatory minimums, about FAMM, please keep them coming. And again, I want to just throw it out there. If you didn't hear at the beginning, we are matching $2 for every $1 donated through the end of the year. Donate at FAMM.org. Just subscribe to 99 Pages and just make sure you let us know that you threw in. And we're going to support up to $5,000. That's a $15,000 opportunity. So we're matching 2 for 1 up to 5K. Really fired up to support you here, Kevin. This is obviously very problematic, very important. Yeah. One thing that you did, your organization FAMM did for me was really put myself in the headspace of like, what is it like in a prison? And you guys actually led a campaign, I believe it was called Visit a Prison, and make sure that you actually, before you vote for all these laws and send people to jail, like maybe we should take a look at what jail is like, Can you put us in the headspace of a prisoner? What's it like there today? And maybe if you wouldn't mind touching on, especially in this particular day and age, what COVID means for these prisoners.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Because when we talk about, doing the time for the crime, then you have these situations where people now, 96% of people in prison are going to come home someday, right? They've got a punishment, but they're coming home. They're coming back out into our community. And now they're in a situation where they're 5.5 times more likely to get COVID because they're in a place where there's no social distancing. There's no health care to speak of. There's no treatment, right? They're in these congregated housing facilities where the disease spreads like wildfire. And at first people said, well, they're going to be like ships. The disease won't get in, but you have staff coming in and out from the community, bringing it in. And so it has devastated the prisons. We've lost, about 1,500 people who were in prison, and family members are, obviously nervous. Prison, it's never a good time to be in prison. This is the worst time that we know of anyone, to be in prison, because they're under lockdown. They're not getting outside. The meals are getting cut back. It is just, the conditions are horrible. And, I think people are tired of hearing about it because we're all tired of COVID, but this is as bad as it's been. So, we did challenge people to visit a prison because it is incredibly frustrating when you're trying to lobby for change and you're talking to lawmakers and policymakers who have no idea what they're talking about. There was a prison reform bill in Congress, and people would say, well, I want everyone in prison to have a job. They're already required to have a job. You just didn't even know that because you know so little about this area that you're regulating. And so we challenge people to go visit a prison because they need to see, as you said, what's it like? And I don't care if somebody comes back and says, oh, I wish it was harsher, or I wish it was more rigid or whatever, but just know what you're talking about before you make policy for all these people. We've got 2.3 million of our fellow Americans in these facilities. We should know what the hell we're talking about. And so that challenge is made to state and federal lawmakers. Being in prison is a different experience depending on the facility you are. But the thing I will say is you'd be surprised who's there. In the same way that the reason I talk about this so much is because I was there and I want to show people a different face of maybe who they thought was inside prison. I was in there with people who are who are in there for federal drug conspiracies, who are in there for federal gun crimes. And just saying that or seeing it on paper, people would think, oh my God, it must have been so dangerous. I didn't feel my life or health was threatened. These people just made stupid mistakes. They weren't the most, I've heard people say these are the most dangerous of people in the world. They're not. There are some bad people in prison. There are people who need to stay there because they're psychopaths or they can't conform their behavior. But, a lot of them aren't that. And they just need a little bit of help to get on the right path, get a job when they come out, get some treatment if they have a drug or alcohol problem or have an anger management issue. But we've got to stop throwing people away. And so in addition to seeing the conditions in the prison, we wanted lawmakers to see who was in there. Meet them, talk to them. You will find people in there just like you, and maybe that'll change your behavior.
Well said, Kevin. So if you're listening out there, you got a lawmaker that you got access to, have them visit a prison. Kevin, the next question that comes to my mind is, and I even got this wrong when we were doing our warm-up here. I thought that and maybe this is true for the most of the country, but let's say you're convicted of a crime, a felony offense, that you lose your right to vote. And so in the back of my head, my thought is that maybe one reason prison life is so horrible is that they don't really have franchise. Like, who is fighting for the voices of, who's representing the voices of the prisoner? But I recognize in some states that's changing. So could you talk a little bit about voting in prison life today?
Yeah, so state law governs who gets the vote. That's how it works. And so we just had this big fight in Florida. You'll probably remember that there was a big campaign because in Florida you were permanently disenfranchised. So they had over 1 million people who couldn't vote. And so they passed the ballot measure to allow them to vote. And now they're fighting out, the specifics there. I live in Maryland, and the law here says that as soon as you get out of prison, you're allowed to vote. Other states, it's after you're finished prison and you're on probation. So, and in other states, they still disenfranchise you permanently. So it really is not set. There's no one set standard. But you're right that, disenfranchising these people as if even when they've paid their debt to society, this is a problem that goes into jobs and everything else. There's just never-ending punishment. It's like you never get out of the penalty box. We send you away to prison. It's the worst thing that you could experience. But even when you come back, we don't welcome you back into society because we take away your right to vote, serve on a jury, own a gun, or do certain things that the rest of us can do.
Wow. So let's say hypothetically that the mandatory minimum, let's just say hypothetically all the mandatory minimums went away tomorrow, right? Mm-hmm. And what problems would still be left over? It seems like mandatory minimums play a significant role, but, especially this year, we saw George Floyd. We saw Jacob, like a lot of police brutality instances that really riled up a lot of communities, a lot of anger and pain in a lot of people's hearts. And so, like, even if the minimums go away, it feels like there's still this sort of like conveyor belt, particularly in minority and impoverished communities, that leads them into the penal system. Like, obviously mandatory minimums play a big role in that, but what are the other pieces? Because FAMM does a lot of work, and I want to give you the platform to talk about some of the other issues you're working on.
Yeah, we mostly focus on sentencing and then what happens while somebody's in prison that helps them get out. But, you know, the George Floyd thing was a moment for us to step back and say, let's try to look at this more holistically. And what you have to realize is that a lot of times the sentence is driven by how many interactions somebody had with law enforcement, right? So, you know, when I went to prison, that was my first offense. But maybe if I had been living in, you know, a city and I had been picked up a few times for different things, rightly or wrongly, now I've got a couple infractions. Now my criminal history is a little bit higher. Now my sentence is going to be higher as a result of that. So you have this feeding problem where if you're black or brown in this country, or just poor, frankly, you're going to have more interactions with law enforcement, and the more interactions you have with law enforcement, the more likely you are going to wind up in prison, and the longer your sentence is going to be, the harder it's going to be when you come out. And so I always say, you know, and I don't say this in a self-flagellating way, I'm just cognizant that, you know, somebody who's white like me and had the resources I did, I benefited at every stage of the process, because even when there's not intentional bias, we have unconscious bias. And I don't just mean the stuff you hear about, you know, implicit bias. I'm talking about things like, there's studies that show that for judges, you know, dark-skinned blacks get longer sentences than light-skinned blacks, who get longer sentences than whites, that there's just all of these ways that the system works against people of color. And, you know, there's only so much we can do with some of it through the law. But I think, as you were saying, the things we have to change are not just like getting rid of mandatories, it's changing the culture that says we are not the worst country in the world, right? We don't think we have the most evil, deprived people in the world, and yet we have the highest incarceration rate by any stretch, right? There's no Western country that even comes close to our incarceration rate. What explains that? You know, what is it about us that is so punitive, that relies on prison so much, that neglects people in prison? If you go to Eastern Europe, if you go to Europe and Germany and some of those countries, you look at their prisons, they're almost like apartments, because they want to get some sense of decency and responsibility, so when you come back out, the integration's easier. When I was in prison, I told people all the time, it infantilizes you. You know, I go to the chow hall for 3 meals, I do my laundry, but I don't pay bills, I don't have to worry about anything. I have a job, but it's not, you know, stressful. So we remove people, we take the most antisocial people, we put them in the most antisocial environment. And so those are things we have to change. And that's cultural. That goes down to not only getting rid of mandatory minimums, but having wardens build people up. To say to somebody who's in prison, call them by their name. Say, I want you to succeed, not you're a piece of garbage who's, you know, a career criminal and you're never going to amount to anything. So it's the whole culture we have. And I think it's really based on our American sort of individualistic spirit, our belief in personal responsibility. We don't see the interconnectedness that much. And so we really are tough on people when they break the law. We have people who, you know, there's people out there who drink and drive, and if they get caught, we throw them in jail for a long time. And yet somebody else who drank and drove is just as punitive, even though they've done the same thing. That happens with taxes. I mean, there's all these studies that show that most Americans commit like 3 felonies a day. They just don't get caught, or they don't even know they're doing it. And yet when somebody does get caught in our country, man, we are not afraid to throw the book at them. And so that has to change. And that's not just with the politicians. We're democracy. They're listening to us. So we've got to rethink what we want from this justice system. And the problems, as you said, were exposed this summer as it affects certain communities more than others.
Wow, man. And I love the way you said that. This government works for us. We got to rethink this problem and make some conscious decisions on what our value systems say about both whether prison is really corrective? Is it rehabilitative, or is it just flat out punitive, right? Is it just checking a block to...
Right. Well, somebody says, a family member will say, well, these politicians, they just do what it takes to get reelected. Well, thank God. I mean, right? So, I mean, if they did, if they were just appointed, they wouldn't care what we think. So the burden's on us. And I say this as an advocate. I mean, every time we're in negotiations over a bill and we don't get everything we want, I think, well, that's our fault. I mean, we didn't create the environment where this guy or woman thinks, I have to do what they want or it's going to cost me politically. So that's on us. So at FAMM, one of the things we're trying to do is mobilize people who have been directly impacted by the system to become advocates, because it's on us to show them that they have people like me and others in their district who've been touched by the system and want change.
Well said, sir. We had a really great question come in, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Can we talk about terminology? For example, people in prison, currently incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, versus prisoners and criminals. Yeah. Like I can kind of understand, like even I know in this broadcast, I've been throwing a few terms out that I probably have been using incorrectly. Perhaps maybe we could just get some clarity on these terms.
Sure. Well, and so even these terms are changing as people are thinking about using humanizing language, because you hear things like they're felons, right? I mean, or they're criminals. Well, people who commit a crime are not criminals their whole life. And so we sort of run people down by saying that. So what we try to use, people first language. So people who committed a crime, people who committed a felony. For people who are in prison, inmate is not a preferred term, because they're not in an asylum. They're in a prison, and so they want to be called either prisoners or incarcerated people, but to keep the focus on the fact that these are people. These are brothers, sisters, cousins, mothers, and fathers to all of us. And so so that's sometimes the language gets a little confusing. Sometimes there's some politically correct language that gets used that people reject, and that's okay too. But you'll hear, people who are in prison are either prisoners, incarcerated people. When they get out, we call them formerly incarcerated, or we call them returning citizens, because they're returning to the community. But I think the important thing to remember is, if you put a label on somebody, are you building them up or are you taking them down? I mean, you can call me a felon the rest of my life. That's fine. Call me a felon in front of my kids. Again, I have advantages that others don't. But to other people, we want to lift them up, and we don't want to judge them by the worst thing they did in their life. And so we want to use language that does that. And so that's, I think, the thing to be most mindful of.
Thank you for that. That's exceptionally well said. We want to use language that even to someone who has been convicted of a crime, we still want to build them up, even with our terminology. Yeah. And it's like that costs $0, right? Yeah. That is something that, just something so simple, it can be so powerful. It's amazing that comes from. I would love to take another dive into your head as president of this very impressive organization. So you've got the mammoth, behemoth prison industrial complex. You got the federal government, 50 state governments. You've got crack, cocaine. You've got mandatory minimums on marijuana in some places. You've got mandatory minimums for just firearm laws. I mean, how do you even begin to tackle this problem? Like, how do you prioritize in your role as president of FAMM?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And it's hard because, as I'm reminded when somebody in my staff always says, everything we say yes to, we're saying no to something else. You don't mean to be, but you are. So you have to set priorities. And for us, we try to do a few things. We've been working in the federal space for a long time, so we're going to continue working there. We've had some good success. We've expanded our state work, but there we're trying to pick out a few things, right? We try to measure certain factors. How bad are the laws? Do they really need changing? Some states have already passed reforms. We're grateful for that. There are others who haven't. So we want to go where the change needs to happen. Also, do we have prospects for success? I mean, do we have any champions? Do we have any lawmakers or governors who are interested in reforming the system? We need that. or we're going to be, it's going to take a long time. So we look at factors like that. And we also, because we are an organization, I always say we are at the intersection of policy and people. So there's a lot of groups that are ideological based. FAMM is nonpartisan. We communicate with 37,000 people in federal prison every week, thousands of affected family members who are both in state and federal prison. They pretty much inform our advocacy, right? So, we were policy experts, we have lawyers and former, sort of policy professionals, but we find out where the worst problems are from the experiences of the people that we work with. They're the ones who are able to highlight, hey, we need help in Pennsylvania because we have more people serving life without parole here than any other state. Okay, that's something where we think we can make a difference. And what we're trying to do at FAMM is, get incremental progress every day, chip away, both the federal system and the 4 states that we sort of choose each year. But while we're doing this track, on the other track, we're trying to use the stories and the communications, like the film we did, The Vanishing Trial, to change the culture, right? We want to move the ground under the politicians' feet. We need to change hearts and minds so that the playing field tilts in our favor. Because without that, we're just going to be running into the same, brick wall every day. What we have to do is mobilize people who have been affected by the system and tell the stories that will make, will change hearts and minds. So we really try to work on 2 tracks. One is sort of the daily grind, changing laws, the lower hanging fruit, the things we can fix today. And then the longer term thing, which we've talked about, which is like changing the culture, the sort of the punitive nature we have in our country.
Absolutely. So totally understand. That makes a lot of sense. You have your fingers on the pulse of a lot of people who are feeding you and educating you on the priorities. And so that's how you direct your efforts. So you don't have to boil the ocean. For example, you saw an opportunity in Pennsylvania and you're going after it because, that's incredible. More people serving, what, did I hear you correctly? More people serving life sentences in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and the racial disparity there is shocking. And, and again, I think the tougher the sentence, the tougher the crime, so those harder sentences, everybody now is for decriminalizing marijuana or, people who are getting these long sentences for low-level drug offenses. The country has shifted in the last 30 years on that. Most people have come around on that. But what we don't realize is that even people who commit more serious offenses can change. They can grow up. They can grow out of those things. We don't need to throw everybody away. Like I said, I'm not proposing that everybody get out, but I am proposing that we stop throwing everybody away. And so that means having mechanisms in place to revisit these long sentences. Even somebody who committed a serious crime does not need to spend the rest of their life in prison. It's not good for them, their family, their community. And as taxpayers, it's not worth it for us. After somebody serves 15 or 20 years, the benefit to public safety of them continuing to be in prison is 0. If they're not likely to reoffend anymore, the thousands and millions of dollars we're wasting locking those people up could be better spent on interventions that do keep us safe. And so we're just misallocating resources when we do this. So, sometimes when we talk cerebrally about economics, cost benefit, people lose it. So again, we try to show the stories of the people we're talking about. People who, if I told you what crime they committed, you'd say, oh, throw that person away. But when you saw them or you met them, as I've had the good pleasure of doing, you'd say, this person deserves a second chance.
Absolutely. And I believe your effort in this is called the Second Chances Initiative. Is that correct?
Yeah.
We want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So we have a Second Chances agenda, which combines a couple different policy proposals, but getting at these extreme sentences that our country gives. Look, 1 out of 7 people in prison today is serving either a life sentence or a virtual life sentence, meaning 50 or more years. No country comes close to this. We have more life sentences than all of Europe combined. Okay. And we don't need to do that. We just chose to do that. We can choose to do differently. And what we're trying to do is our laws, especially our mandatory sentencing laws, are good at throwing people away, but we don't have a lot of mechanisms for different actors in the system to revisit those long sentences. So we need presidents and governors to use their clemency authority. So for somebody who got an outrageous sentence, to be able to fix that. We saw the President Trump do that with Alice Marie Johnson, a grandmother who was supposed to serve a life sentence. There was no reason for that. We want to give judges a chance to resentence people after 15 years. It's called the second look law. It allows people to go back before a judge after 15 years to say, look, I've changed, I've been rehabilitated, or maybe society's idea of what the proper punishment has changed, but the law hasn't, so I want another chance. And so that's second look laws. And then compassionate release, which is something FAMM's worked a lot on, and that is that we lock up a lot of old and sick people who present no threat to public safety, but they're the costliest to keep in prison because of health care and other accommodations we have to make. So it's exactly backwards what you do. You want to target your resources on the people who are at the biggest risk to public safety. We do the opposite. We spend the most on people who pose little risk. So compassionate release, clemency, and second look laws make up our second chances agenda to revisit these extreme sentences that our country hands down.
You know what? I subscribe to your social media following, etc. And in terms of compassionate release, I saw that. I mean, in a world of negativity, I saw this absolutely heartwarming post of a daughter, and I think you actually emailed it out to your following as well, of the daughter of a prisoner who saw, I think at a very young age, her father go to prison on something like a 25-year sentence, if I'm not mistaken. And he served, forgive me, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but anyway, like either 7 or 13 of those years, and then got a compassionate release because of work that you had done.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could tell a little bit more of this story and what that felt like and what the mechanics were of getting that person out.
Yeah, and we see, we're so blessed to see this a lot in our work. We get to see the fruits of it, and I wish people did. I mean, I have I have a member on my board who was serving a life sentence and was granted clemency by President Obama. He was supposed to die in prison. Now he's a violence interrupter in the District of Columbia. He's saving lives. And another one, Sean Hopwood, who's had a famous story because he was on 60 Minutes, but he was an armed bank robber. Now he's a Georgetown law professor. We see these examples of redemption so often. And this woman wrote to us, and she was seeking compassionate release because her father was serving this extreme sentence, was at risk of COVID. And it was a beautiful thing. She posted a picture of, she was, I think, 4 years old when he went to prison. And you see her in the prison visiting room. I've had that unfortunate experience of you're sitting there in your uniform and your kids come to visit you, but you take a picture because you want that. That's the only connection you can have. And she then, fast forward, I think it's 15 years her dad's been in, and they sought compassionate release because of COVID and because of his risk of that. And the judge decided to let him out. And I just would say to people, it's okay to be tough on crime. It's just, we've had the worst punishment inflation in the world. What we used to give 15 years for, now we give 30 or life for. So we're not saying that you shouldn't have proportionate sentences, that people who commit more serious crimes get more serious punishments. It's just they don't need to be life sentences. They don't need to be 30, 40 years. There's just no benefit to those.
Punishment inflation. Talk about man. I'm going to use that one for sure. We had a couple great questions come in, if you don't mind. One from Ken Boucher's. Are there any laws against the conditions between private and state-owned prisons? Like private prisons should be more up to date, or vice versa. Are there any deltas between private and versus public prisons?
Yeah, it's such a mixed bag. So let me just say this. First, prisons at the federal level make up a small percentage of prisons. In some of the states, they make up more. I think a lot of us have just a natural bias against the idea of people profiting off incarceration. So I think that rubs people the wrong way. So I think that's a lot of what you see against private prisons, and I sympathize with that. In terms of conditions, it's a mixed bag. So like in Florida and Texas, those are institutions where the private facilities are the only ones that have air conditioning. So we have been we've run a couple campaigns called Beat the Heat to expose the conditions both in Florida and in Texas, because in those places in the summer, those prisons can get to be 120 degrees and people suffer heat stroke and the rest. So in some places, the conditions in private prisons are better. In others, the state prisons are better. In terms of regulation, it also is a mixed bag. It's up to the government in their contracts, when they contract with these private prison companies, to require oversight and accountability, but they don't do it that often. Now, the problem is they don't really offer much oversight and transparency of their own facilities. So another thing FAMM has been working on is creating independent oversight in the states and at the federal level. There was just a bill that passed in New York that's going to allow the Correctional Association of New York, which is a nonprofit group, to visit prisons without notice. So they'll have what's called golden key access, so they can go into prisons and investigate complaints and things like that. Our prisons are so closed off. The reason we have the abuse and the neglect that we have is because nobody can get in there. I mean, visitor prison was part of the reason we did that, but we need professional oversight and investigators who can go in there and find out what's going on, because, you know, sunlight's the best disinfectant, as they said. And if you're a correctional officer and no one's looking over your shoulder, you're going to do things you shouldn't do. And so we need oversight. And like I said, so it's a mixed bag. Some private facilities I've heard horror stories about, but I've heard plenty of horror stories about public facilities too. The bottom line is all of them need better transparency and accountability.
100%. We had another question come in. What are your thoughts on clemencies granted by President Obama to prisoners for marijuana? And should he have done more? And I think this is an interesting question because, you know, every time the clemency and compassionate release or the pardon lists get put out, I mean, every president has, you know, a handful. I mean, let's say it's like a few dozen people. They'll have a, you know, handful of folks that are wrongly that are in jail for a drug charge like marijuana. While at the same time on the ballot, it's getting legalized in like every state. Every time it ends up on the ballot, it is legalized. Yeah. So I'm just curious here, like, it feels like these individual, I think what the question is trying to get at is like these individual clemencies, it's like, okay, that's wonderful. But is there, what are your expectations of, say, an incoming President Biden? Like, this is what you need to do in the first 100 days to fix this problem.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we were part of President Obama's clemency initiative. We and four other groups put together this massive pro bono effort where we were getting lawyers we trained them how to file clemency petitions for all these people that we thought met the conditions. And what President Obama did is, you're right, you can give individual clemency to people who deserve mercy, and there's one-offs, right? But what President Obama, I think, tried to do was to make a point about how those draconian drug laws of the 80s and 90s needed to change. So he didn't do a handful. He ended up commuting the sentences of 1,700 drug offenders. And some of those, hundreds of them were serving life penalties. They were 3 strikes and you're out, drug life sentences. So we thought that was, you know, fantastic. Could he have done more? Yes. And I think what this question gets at, and you're asking about, is, you know, could we do this in a categorical way? And I think in some places that makes sense, right? I still think you want to review everybody individually. You want to make sure that their prison record's okay, that they have a place to go home to, all those sorts of things. But the fact that we have people still in federal prison serving life sentences for marijuana, when you see, as you said, what's happening in the country, South Dakota is legalizing marijuana, right? So it's happening everywhere. The fact that we have people serving, I think it would be totally appropriate for the president, and we would encourage President Biden to do this, to look at categories or classes of people, and then look within that class to make sure everybody qualified and was deserving. But yeah, I think it's really important. I think, you know, President-elect Biden drafted a lot of these mandatory minimum drug laws at the federal level when he was in the Senate. I know he said it was a mistake, and I think using his clemency authority to change those would be a really powerful statement. I think it goes not only to criminal justice and public safety, it goes to racial justice, which the country is seeking. Yeah, I mean, the state governors should be doing the same. They should be using their clemency authority to get people out who don't need to be there. It's the smart, right thing to do. It's humane, and even if you didn't think it was humane, trust me, it'll make you safer, because we're wasting millions of dollars on people who don't need to be there.
Well, you know, to that point, Kevin, I'm a veteran, I'm in tech, I'm an immigrant. Like, I have a lot of, let's just say, a lot of heartstrings that could be pulled, right? And I think when I think about why FAMM has really won me over and like really got the strong rope of my heart, it's not because we're spending a ton of money. It's because, you know, money is one thing, but the thing you can't get back is time, right? And it's like, I think as I grow older and, you know, I have a family now. I'm, I'm more established. And I think to myself, if I had to go to jail, like if I had to give even a day, a month, a week of my precious time away for a stupid law that has zero impact on American domestic security, I think my head would explode. Right? Like, I mean, and forgive me if that's and I absolutely am coming from a place of privilege. I can say that. And yeah, I mean, forget the money we're spending. Obviously that argument's going to work, but just think about the debt of time that we are consuming out of American citizens' lives, or the lives of American residents, or just human beings in general. Talk about a massive waste and value.
Yeah, I worry that, look, I had to go through this experience to better appreciate it myself.
Yeah.
And, Abraham Lincoln said, if you want to get rid of a bad law, enforce it strictly. And I think that's what's happening right now. I mean, part of the way we can dismantle mass incarceration is we've sent so many damn people to prison. So, more families are being affected by it. After the FBI raided my house, the next morning, I had neighbors coming up to me individually saying, hey, I've never told anybody this, but my dad went to prison. I never told anybody, but my brother was in prison. Everyone was talking about it. I said, I wouldn't have known that. And it was, and I'm in a decent suburb of Maryland. And I thought, we're sending so many people away. We're depriving so many people of their freedom. Now there's still shame and stigma that goes with it. So not enough people are talking about it. But when people realize how many people it impacts, I think they understand the need for change. But to get them to understand it at a human level is hard, because we also have this really strong evolutionary instinct to punish others. We want to drive out the bad person. We want to see them as somebody who's different than us. They broke the law. They can't follow the rules, and we hammer them. But we've got to get away from that and realize that we can get our pound of flesh. We can hold the people accountable without putting them in a jail cell 10 hours away from their house. There were other things you could have done to me. You could have had me, volunteer at charities, do other things, give my time in a way that you thought was constructive, but let me be with my family. And more importantly, let my young kids be with me. Why perpetuate the harm by taking me out of this household? So I just think it's a cultural shift that has to happen. We've just got to, it doesn't mean you don't have to be tough on crime or love crime or not want to deter crime. Just realize that what we do is overkill.
Absolutely. We're about to close out here. I'm going to absolutely give you the last word, but before we do, I have a little bit of an interesting question for you. If you were to recommend books to our following, like a book or a reading that could help us just better empathize with this problem, what are some books that you would recommend to our following?
That's a good question. I read a lot about this, more than I should. I'm going to make a plug for a book called Lawman by Sean Hopwood, who I mentioned was on our board and was the subject of a 60 Minutes profile that was beautiful about his story, because Sean brings you in prison, lets you know his experience, and he was there for robbing banks. So this is somebody we all think probably should have got prison time, and yet. He's changed his life. There's a new book out now. It's Amazon just said it was a bestseller. I mean, just declared it its best recommendation for the year. It's called Knock at Midnight, Brittany Barnett. And Brittany is a fantastic African-American young woman who has spent her career, she was in finance, and she was so moved because of her mother's incarceration to get involved in this space. And now she spends all her time trying to get people out of life sentences for drugs. And so she has a group called Buried Alive that works on that. And so that's A Knock at Midnight by Brittany Barnett. There's tons of other good books. Prisoners of Politics by Rachel Barkow. It's a little more academic, but it talks about the politics here, how we allow fear-mongering and our fear of crime and our politicians' desire to capitalize on that for their own benefit to drive bad policy. So that's a little more academic treatment, whereas Sean's and Brittany's are a little more personal. But I think those three are really good books to understand what we're up against.
Absolutely. All right. So as we close out here, you've got a captive audience, and of course, we're going to have a lot more viewers throughout the week.
Yeah.
Again, folks, we are matching donations 2-to-1. Go to fam.org, then let us know at 99 pages what you gave. We're going to take care of that. And we're going to make sure that we are a wind in the sails of this organization. Yeah, I'm just so fired up by the work you do, and really by the pain that you're relieving in the community. So thank you, Kevin. I'd love to give you the last word and have you give your call to action for our following.
Yeah.
What can we do to help you do what you need to do?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank you for this opportunity and thank you for your support. It means so much. I mean, we don't get government funding, right? So like we rely on donations and contributions to do our work. So, when I was a lobbyist trying to get clients, I'm lining my pocket when I get clients, right? And it benefits me when I sell somebody. But I can say, purely that the work that our organization is doing, I know we're on the right path. I know we're doing good things. We're a nonprofit. We're very careful stewards of the money we receive, but it's all through contributions. So thank you for that. One is get involved either, with a group like FAMM, and you can text FAMM to 21333 to get involved with us and start finding out what we're doing either in your state or at the federal level. Or there's plenty of organizations as issues gotten bigger. And so at the local level, we're seeing really a focus on electing better district attorneys, better sheriffs, better judges in states that elect judges. So there's tons of opportunities to get involved through groups like ours or the other ones that are there. But the thing you have to do is just care. You have to understand that it matters, and that even if you didn't have a loved one in prison, or you yourself never went to prison, that it impacts you, because we all want public safety. We all want safe streets and safe neighborhoods to raise our kids and to live in. And so how we spend our resources and how we treat one another to try to create community safety matters. And there's better and worse ways of doing that. And so what we want to try to do is fix that system. And also just know that politicians think they can vote for these bad laws because they think you don't care, or they think you do support punitive policies. And so you have to become educated. And I always say, become a noisy voter. Don't just vote based on criminal justice reform. Tell people you're voting on criminal justice reform. Tell your lawmaker or your local representative, I care about criminal justice reform and I'm voting. I just want you to know that, because then it puts in their head, I have to care about how that is. One thing FAMM is trying to do through our work, and that's why I said to sign up for our emails and action alerts, is we try to make it as easy as possible. We know people are busy, especially families who have loved ones in prison. They work in 2 jobs because they lost a breadwinner. They don't have a lot of time. They can't always show up at the church for the in-person meeting. They can't always go to the march or the rally. But we try to give them the tools so that they can tweet at their lawmakers. They can send emails. They can make calls. We do phone blitzes. We try to make everybody who has a heart and a willingness to advocate into an advocate. And so I would just say, get involved. You can make a difference. We have seen individuals, change lives. And I assure you it will be rewarding. Giving to us financially is helpful. Getting involved personally in ways will be rewarding to you. You will see people who you might have thought in a previous life that person should rot in prison. And then you're going to see that person come out, be reunited with their family, and contribute to their society in a way that will make you so proud that you'll be hooked. And you'll want to do this work forever. I didn't think I did. But I'm telling you, it is the most meaningful thing I can do right now, and I think you'd feel the same way.
Absolutely. Sir, thank you so much for what you do. Thank you for coming on today, educating us about this problem. And folks, just to crystallize, this 2 calls to action. 1, get involved, and 2, donate financially. And to that last end, again, 99 pages is matching $2 for every one donated up to $5K. That's a $15,000 opportunity for us to get this problem solved with Kevin and FAMM. Kevin, thanks again. And to all you out there in the universe, have a wonderful evening, and we'll